Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to all our attendees. I'm very happy you could join us for this post-COVID reboot panel session on security and data privacy considerations. My name is Bridget Maloney. I'm the Managing Director of GEDI at the University of Waterloo. And GEDI, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the gateway for enterprises to discover innovation at Waterloo. The University of Waterloo is proud to host this webinar. It's the third in a 6-part panel series. As we all know, COVID-19 has shaken the world, challenging societies and altering life as we know it. But from this crisis, opportunities have emerged calling us to action as we prepare to reboot from this COVID-19 lockdown. How we work and behave, how society and the economy will function, and how we innovate and educate will change. So plotting the future for Canada, your enterprise, and yourself, it's complicated and challenging. Our researchers and the university partners are happy to share their research and perspectives. So just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have a question for our panel, please send it via the WebEx Q&A. Click on Q&A in the bottom right corner of your window and select all panelists before sending. I wanted to let you know this event is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the official U of Waterloo YouTube channel after this series. So now I would like to introduce you to our panelists.
Well, thank you, Bridget, and thanks to your team at GEDI and the University of Waterloo. The serious problems facing humanity require deep understanding and collaboration among a diverse range of people and organizations. So I jumped at the chance to help facilitate this webinar on one of the important challenges we need to address together. And a special thanks to the audience for taking the time to participate in this discussion. And ultimately, solving the important problems we're facing is not a spectator sport, so it's great to see so many people eager to engage. And now it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our panel. I'm excited by the caliber of the panel and the diverse range of perspectives they'll bring to the discussion. We have Deborah Evans, the Chief Privacy Officer at Rogers Communications, Maura Grossman, Research Professor and Director of Women in Computer Science here at the University of Waterloo, and Adjunct Professor at Osgood Hall Law School, Plinio Morita, Assistant Professor, School of Public Health and Health Systems, Michael Parker, Principal Corporate Security Analyst in Governance, Risk and Compliance at BlackBerry, and Douglas Stabila, Associate Professor, Cryptography in the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization of Mathematics. So for this discussion, we're going to dive into the data privacy and security considerations for Canadians in the context of COVID-19. And we're going to start with the here and now and discuss emerging threats that are enabled and exacerbated by COVID-19. And then we'll dive into the interplay between privacy and public health, including the issues surrounding contact tracing in the context of modern technologies. Will new contact tracing tools save lives? Will they hurt our freedoms? Or are there ways to deploy them while protecting our privacy and freedoms? Are the privacy protecting versions ready for showtime or just an academic point? Decisions are being made now and need to be made now, and the implications are very significant. And then we'll start to shift from discussing reactive responses in essentially real time to discussing proactive measures we can take to emerge from this pandemic as strongly as we can. So for example, how do we address the privacy and security issues for workers returning to work? And more broadly, sociologists understand a range of human biases that hold us back from achieving our positive potential, such as myopia bias, inertia bias, simplification bias, and so on. But COVID-19 gives us a great jolt, a visceral appreciation of the consequences of, for example, focusing only on the present and not also preparing for the future. And it motivates us to consciously overcome these biases. Though at some point, we know amnesia bias, which is the tendency to forget the lessons of past disasters, will kick in. So we now have a window of opportunity before amnesia kicks in to subvert these human instincts and to set us on a better path for humanity. So we'll end the discussion by discussing what we might be able to do to shape a better future, including greater protection of privacy and personal freedoms, greater security against cyber threats, things that can serve as a stronger foundation for building a more just and a prosperous future for humankind. So let's start by asking, how the security and privacy threat landscape has changed as a result of the pandemic. Deborah, do you mind starting off with your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So what I'm particularly have been noticing during the pandemic is the fraudsters are getting more and more inventive in finding ways to obtain people's personal information. There's new and inventive ways that they're always trying to get your information. We've seen everything from the phishing emails where people are getting bill notification ready messages and they think that they're going on to pay a bill and they're clicking on it, but it's actually phishing, and it looks exactly like your, they're more sophisticated than ever. It looks exactly like your bill. There's ones that are coming from, this is the government, this is your I live in Toronto as an example, and there's actually letters. They're sending letters from Toronto Hydro saying this is your refund, right? They're not resting. So, and I don't want to suggest it's, people are taking their eye off the ball, but with consumers are rightfully looking elsewhere because they're more concerned about other things. There's a lot going on people's minds. So the fraudsters, I think, are taking advantage of that. And this is all against the backdrop of a changing landscape for privacy law in general. So the government has been working a lot on the digital economy and the revising and the modernization of PIPEDA, the federal law that governs private sector privacy. So all of this is happening, and it's sort of, I don't want to suggest it's happening in a vacuum because all things are meeting and there's sort of a Venn diagram somewhere where these are all overlapping, but it's just, there's a lot happening. Society is rightfully, like I said, rightfully looking elsewhere because there's bigger concerns, and the fraudsters are filling that void, and they're really taking advantage, I think, of society's greater concerns, and that's unfortunate. I mean, I know for me as chief privacy officer at my company, I'm busier now than I've ever been because of all of these frauds that are happening. People are wanting more access to their information. They're wanting to find out more information. So I'm busier than I've ever been. I think in my 5 years, I've managed the privacy portfolio at my company. But so, I mean, those are just some high level thoughts from me.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Deborah. I do think that there's a lot of malicious people out there that are taking advantage of the situation. As well, you mentioned the fact that people are looking for alternate sources, and I think that's one of the avenues that people are chasing down in a rush to get up-to-date information. So you've got parties that are basically making sites available that presume or present themselves as being somewhat authoritative in providing that information that people are looking for, where in reality it's an avenue for downloading malware. You've also got people, I think there was a tool called COVID Lock, which was an app that was put up on the Google website, which was put out there for people to download thinking it was going to be something useful and helpful, when in reality it was a ransomware tool. So absolutely, those things are happening. You've also got people coming to the door making representations that they're from like the health departments doing, knocking on doors of especially people that are potentially not necessarily savvy in social engineering type activities. And this is really just a way for people to get into the door and to case out your environment, or even perhaps rob you outright while you're actually supporting their questionnaires that they provide. So.
Absolutely, Michael. It's a case of we're home more, we have more time on our hands, we're more susceptible to some of these social engineering because as a society, people are putting more out there. People are at home, so they're posting more on their social media channels, so they're making more available. And those fraudsters, they're still sitting in their computer rooms looking for your information in order to, their end goal.
Yeah. If you're talking about, I could focus more on some of the technical issues that we're seeing as well. I mean, obviously, with the pandemic and the work from home mandates that a lot of organizations have implemented, we've totally basically removed multiple layers of protection that you would normally expect to have in place. So you don't have your physical security controls from a secure facility anymore. No security guards, no cameras, no egress and egress monitoring. So now you've basically got a diffuse workforce working from home on typically insecure networks. it becomes much more critical now for organizations to basically look at their endpoints, their laptops, their desktops, and make sure that they're being properly managed, properly secured. Basically, take a zero trust approach to your workforce. Um, looking at things like network access control and multi-factor authentication, and really making sure that you're monitoring your policies to make sure that you've got proper awareness for your workforce, so they know not to undertake potentially risky or unhygienic behaviors in their workday.
Absolutely, Michael. It's kind of hard to say, as corporations, we have our workflows reset their password every 3 months, and that typically has to be done over the corporate network. Well, we are in an environment where we're telling people don't make non-essential travel. So now you can't have someone, if their password is up for reset in that 3 months, you can't have someone go to your location to get onto the corporate network to do that. So there's been a lot of sort of, hate using buzzwords, but there's been a lot of pivoting in the cyber world of getting different protections or making sure that there's greater monitoring that the fraudsters are not finding a hole somewhere.
Yeah.
I think there's also, this is more of I think because so many more people are glued to the internet 24/7, including children who were in school before, but now they're on the internet, and they're particularly vulnerable. But we've seen this increase in the use of video conferencing, cloud-based storage, collaboration tools, and not everybody was terribly technically savvy or competent in using these tools. And I think we saw this prevalence of Zoom bombing when people first started to use Zoom, and nobody realized, that they could put a password on a conference or control access to who came in and who didn't. And I think people are starting to get a little bit more savvy now, but you have lots of people using tools they weren't familiar with. Another issue, I'm a lawyer, and for lawyers and others who deal with large volumes of confidential or proprietary data, it's much harder to protect that information, for me to maintain an attorney-client privilege, or for somebody to protect trade secrets when they're working from home, when they're sharing a computer, perhaps with other family members. They have children leaning over their shoulder during the day while they're working. People overhear your private conversations. And I agree with both of you that we're much more sitting ducks for all kinds of phishing attacks. When they look like COVID updates, or they look like a government check that you're expecting, and we're distracted, we're more fearful, and we're more likely to click on these things than at other times.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Deborah.
Sorry, I was going to say absolutely more. I saw a great piece, and I really wish I could remember the think tank that put it out, because it was so great, of the privacy and security of all these video platforms. And there must have been about 20 or 25 on the list, and I'd probably only heard about half a dozen of them. So there's so many niche ones out there, and there's so much to consider. And you're thinking, well, my company said I can only use ABC, but now you're joining with other people whose companies only use, and it's just so complicated. And I mean, I know our cybersecurity head, you mentioned the word Zoom to him, and I think he gets paralyzed because this is the worst. So
Yeah, there's definitely been a rush to adopt technology to facilitate ongoing work where organizations weren't necessarily prepared to do that. So you mentioned use of these video conferencing tools, and again, the intent behind them is obviously is benign, but sometimes these tools have capabilities that weren't fully understood, or they were available and they just weren't properly configured or locked down. So now you have cases where people are using tools with capabilities to do video monitoring or attention monitoring during meetings, and that also leads to other issues, like how are those being used? Are they being used to just facilitate participation in the meeting, or attendance at a meeting, or are they being actually used to monitor performance during a meeting? So it is very important that as we continue down this path, that those tools that we're deploying, we need to standardize, we need to evaluate, we need to properly configure the controls, and make sure that they're being used appropriately, and without violating anyone's privacy or integrity. I wanted to again just quickly touch base in regards to that endpoint security as well. I mean, you already mentioned the fact that you have people working at home and people listening over shoulders. Well, again, we've also got to look at the fact that we now have tools that we're basically connecting via an unsecure hostile network. The Wi-Fi home networks are typically not considered a secure environment in a corporate world anyway. So we need to be looking at new technologies that are going to facilitate that secure environment. So things like always on VPN connectivity, Meraki boxes. And we also need to force out policies in regards to ensuring that your other devices on your Wi-Fi network, that are in close proximity, that are also being properly managed and are properly being patched.
And some hackers are playing a short game, some are playing a long game, and we generally hear about the short game, they stealing money now, healthcare fraud now, or just cyber vandalism now, but then there's the longer game plays like IP theft and so on. Any thoughts on to what extent we think there's adversaries out there who aren't trying to do anything noticeable now, but are certainly gaining a huge advantage over people and organizations by the extra traffic that is now being transmitted and not being protected as well. And again, not necessarily, we're not going to feel it today. We might not know in 10 years how that happened, but it's something that could have been facilitated because our guard is down now. Any perspectives on the long game that some organizations might be playing?
I do think there were many companies that were law firms, for example, are prime targets for hacking because they have everybody's most intimate information that's very valuable if you want to ransom it. But I think there's much more casual dealing with very private information that's now being exchanged in ways I think that are less protective than they would be, if people were behind their regular firewall. So I think you pose an important issue that long term, important corporate information and health information and other things that, some of which we'll talk about, are at a much greater risk in the long term, the longer we stay exchanging information in more casual ways.
Also, if I could quickly add, and I'm sure Michael has opinions on this too, but it's for the threat actors. So you have the ones that are the fraudsters that just want to make the quick buck now, get some personal information, sell it, versus the state actors that are looking for that long-term gain, I guess is what you're asking. So there's the opportunistic people that are just in it to just make a quick buck, or what information that they can sell on the dark web, versus those that really have a longer term objective of, we've seen a lot over time about, those that have destabilizing democracy, those people, the Cambridge Analytica incident from 18 months ago about who is involved in manipulating elections and that sort of thing. So those things are still happening in the background as we play out with all of these short-term gains as well.
Great. So now focusing now our attention on contact tracing. Right. That's one of the issues that has arisen, and we're seeing countless op-eds and position papers and decisions in this happening daily, basically. I'd like to ask, how important are contact tracing technologies for curbing the progression of the pandemic? What is the added benefit brought by actually doing it? Do we need to use them, or can we ride out the pandemic just fine without them? Why are health officials around the world so interested in contact tracing solutions? Do you want to start with some comments, Michael?
Sure, yeah. So I can't speak to the social epidemiology of contact tracing. That's not my area, but clearly there's a perception among certain groups that contact tracing is one of the critical tools in our toolbox to help curb it. The primary anticipated benefit, of course, is a reduction in secondary infections and the capability of health officials to trace the progression of infections throughout a region. Obviously, there's different ways of doing this. Some are more labor intensive than others, manual and automated. And the automated, of course, is the one that's pretty much in the press the most right now in regards to applications on mobile phones. So obviously in that case, it helps as an alerting system to potentially infected people so they can take appropriate steps and actions to monitor and manage their own response. When someone's been alerted that they've been in proximity to a suspected infected person, they can take action for their own health benefit. So right now, there's a lot of ongoing debate about the use and efficacy of any of those solutions. There's no real consensus on the right approach. Lots of people have lots of different opinions. I think for me, the biggest question right now is less about, how can we anonymize the data and make sure it's secure, because we do have those capabilities. Those are of options right now. I think right now the key question is, how much of the population needs to be using the tool for it to actually be effective. And right now, there's not even consensus on that. I've heard as low as 30% to as much as 80%. And I think what we're seeing, though, if we look across the globe, where it's not been mandatory, uptake has been very, very poor. And in my own unscientific polls of my colleagues and friends here in Canada, most people that I've spoke to aren't willing at all to actually use any kind of an application. They've just been There's too many prior incidents where that trust is being violated, and I suspect that it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle for us to actually see that be used successfully.
Plinio, do you want to comment on this? This is sort of right up your research alley.
Definitely, I'll be happy to. So the answer to the question, the second question, like ultimately, are we able to ride the pandemic without the use of these tools? Yes, we are. We've been doing this for a long time. Like public health officials are very proficient in doing contact tracing using simple tools like a phone. We have a number of volunteers across Canada calling patients that have been identified as having COVID-19 and using simple technologies like phone connections to trace the prior contacts that individual had. What the contact tracing technology, like mobile phone based ones, are going to bring to the table are like they would optimize the process. It would reduce the human labor necessary to do this contact tracing. It would be more reliable because now instead of asking people like, who did you get in touch with over the past 14 days and having that individual remember all the connection points, now you could do that through technology. I'm not saying that technology is perfect. There are several cases of false positives and false negatives that would be present in the use of digital contact tracing solutions, but that would be a great benefit. But going back to what Michael mentioned, it is very important for these tools to be successful. You need to have a large user base, different than what you do over the phone, that you're only using that individual as a source of data. When you're doing digital contact tracing, you need both individuals to have the technology installed on their phone. So if you have a low user base, basically you're going to walk through the grocery store or go visit a friend that hasn't downloaded the app, and consequently that contact would not be logged.
Douglas, in Michael's remarks, thanks a lot, Plinio. That was very helpful. Douglas, I'm wondering if you can comment on one point Michael said, and then add any other comments, of course, in that, there are privacy preserving versions of these contact tracing apps. So that's not the main issue. Is it really that sort of said and done, and that there's nothing, we don't need to worry about not so privacy preserving versions going out, or is there more to be done, or what are your general perspectives on, at least from a technology perspective, the technology risks to these contact tracing apps, compromising people's privacy, and which I imagine is one of the reasons so many people choose not to download them.
Well, I think before even getting into the technology, there are many goals that are getting lumped under the same term as contact tracing. There's exposure notification, which is telling me that I've been exposed to someone that has a positive diagnosis. Then there are a whole bunch of other things that are also getting lumped under that same term, like risk notification, where people record their temperature and symptoms in an app. There's the goal of informing public health authorities on hotspots, informing scientists to be able to collect data to run analyses on. And all those things are getting lumped together into the same term. Some of them can be accomplished with technology that is very privacy respecting. So exposure notification, the Apple Google API, that's something that can be done with local Bluetooth transmissions and no centralized data collection. Whereas, collecting data for public health authorities to identify hotspots, that's something that requires centralized data collection and probably GPS information, which is much more privacy invasive. So it really depends which goal we're trying to accomplish to know which the right technology is. I think you're muted, Mike.
Oh, sorry. Let him get away with that? Okay.
Sorry, you were muted. We didn't hear what you were saying. You're still muted. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I just wanted to ask if anyone wants to respond to Douglas's comments there.
I think he's actually spot on. When I said that, we do have the capabilities, I do believe that the capabilities are out there, that the tools exist. It's how they're implemented. So, to his comment about using GPS technology, yeah, sure, it definitely would be. But can we anonymize that GPS technology? Can we delink that from an individual? Absolutely, we can. At what level does that GPS have to be collected? Does it have to be, to the square foot or, to the square kilometer? Depending on how we utilize these tools and how we utilize the technology, I do think that we can absolutely do this in a manner, it's a win-win situation where we can enable the various contact tracing activities that Douglas mentioned and do it in a way that's going to respect individual privacy.
We shouldn't underestimate the difficulty of doing them properly. So it's very easy to de-anonymize data. There are lots of examples of anonymized data sets being released, and then very clever researchers working backwards and finding out stuff. And in my field of cryptography, there are lots of fancy research techniques that we can apply for processing data in a supposedly privacy preserving way, but they're really complex technologies that we've never deployed on as large a scale as we're talking about. So I'd be very skeptical of our ability to very quickly and correctly implement a solution using these technologies without making mistakes.
Fair point.
I was going to add that I agree with you, Doug, that the tracing applications serve fundamentally different purposes, and people may feel very differently about what we'll call the self-protective ones that give you notice that you've been exposed to someone who has tested positive or someone who has symptoms, and those which we'll call epidemiological monitoring, which are not for me per se, but they allow public health authorities to use aggregate data to develop models, to predict things, to develop policies. And I think that both of these applications raise very different issues for people, but I agree with you, they're being lumped together as if they're one thing, and you may feel okay about the first and not okay about the second, and you should actually have that choice to choose one of those but be unwilling to do the other. And I don't know right now if the technology permits you to say okay to the first use but not to the second use.
Can I? Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that the biggest issue that we're facing today is our lack of preparedness. Like if you look back, like we have had epidemiologists for the past like 15, 20 years warning us about a potential pandemic. This is nothing new. We had movies being released about it, and we spent the past 15 years laughing about it, right? And now it's a reality. And if we had listened to these individuals like 10, 15 years ago, we would be in a much better position today. And I think this is what we need to do moving forward. Like, I think we need to take our lessons from this pandemic, like all of the challenges that we're having with the development of all of these solutions that Douglas just mentioned. Like, if you ask me, they are all important. They're all necessary from a public health point of view. But I agree that this idea of bundling everything together is not the right solution, especially because there are a number of countries out there that are misusing this information. So it's not like, if we think about Canada, like we are relatively safe compared to other countries around the world that are severely misusing data that is being shared by individuals. So the biggest lesson that we need to take from all of this is how can we move forward? How can we be smarter and better prepared for either for the next wave of the pandemic or for the future, a future situation like this?
So touching on one of the points you raised, Plinio, on sort of the government potentially misusing governments around the world potentially misusing this, how can we ensure that the information collected by these technologies is not misused by governments and corporations? And are there any existing regulations like GDPR that offer us some sort of protection in that direction? Deborah, do you want to maybe start with some of the general policy guidelines, and then we can jump into some other details or examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So apart from obviously the privacy laws that exist within, here, Personal Information and Electronic Documents Protection Act, and then there's the GDPR, and then California obviously has CCPA down in the US. Aside from the general privacy laws, there have been guidelines and guidance that have been issued by the global regulators about this specific issue of contact tracing. So the European Union Commission came out with a set of guidelines. The Office of the Federal Privacy Commissioner and the provincial privacy commissioners came out with a joint statement of guidelines. And there's also some corporations that have come out with guidelines. So for example, the GSMA, so the GSM Association, which is 750-ish mobile carriers globally, have come out with guidelines, and they all have similar sort of concepts. So I think the first one is legal basis. So what is the legal basis for the collection and the use of the information? So ensuring that there is an appropriate level of authority to collect the information. And then from there, it's necessity and proportionality run all the way through these. So is the information that's being collected, is it necessary for the policy objective? So what's the proportionality there? You need X, but what are you trying to achieve with it? And will collecting that information achieve the policy goal? So also there's limiting the purpose. So ensuring that, these organizations, the governments are limiting their purpose. So their purpose for their collection, for their use, and then also for their disclosure. Also baking in strong de-identification / aggregation / anonymization, call it what you will, but it's really ensuring that this information is de-identified. I'm trying to think, one of them, not Canada, I actually think it might be the European Union has a prohibition on deliberate re-identification as part of the guidelines. And then it's also safeguards, but then another important element of these guidelines are time limitation. So you've collected it for A, you've used it for A, now you're done with it. So ensuring that you're not retaining that information. So these are all general concepts that apply in privacy law globally, and then they've just come out with the added layer of guidelines to govern this concept. So, I think that if the governments are following these guidelines, I think we have to trust in our governments that they're following these guidelines and that they're doing it in an ethical manner. But there are strong guidelines that have been issued, and that's what's important here for this.
Maura, do you want to jump in with some thoughts on the legal and other aspects?
Sure. So these tools, in order to work, they have to be voluntary, and they must involve enough transparency and explicit informed consent. As we mentioned before, we're not sure of the exact number. I've heard 40%, but if enough people aren't willing to use them, and we can't get trust in them, they're basically useless. People won't trust them if they don't know exactly what information is being collected, what's being done with that data, where it's being stored and how secure that storage is, who has access to it, how long it's going to be maintained, and so forth. And that information has to be provided in a manner that's more user-friendly and less legalese than the typical terms of service that most of us our eyeballs go back into our head. We don't read them. We just press click. And I'll confess, I may have been involved in writing a few of those earlier in my career. And I think it's really important, and this one's controversial, but I think it's important that the source code and the technical specifications are made public so that they can be examined independently by other people. They can be tested, audited, bugs can be worked out, they can be improved, and perhaps most important, so that the public can know that they work as they're intended to work, both from an efficacy point of view and also with respect to privacy and security. And finally, I think we need to give some consideration to two things. One being, how do we keep this personal data from becoming compelled by force of law, for example, by law enforcement, because once it exists, people are going to want it. And also, how do we implement accountability for privacy violations? So should there be a consumer protection agency like the FTC in the United States, or should it be the telecom regulator like the CRTC in Canada? But should somebody be in charge of this process and have enforcement power if there are breaches?
That's a lot of great insights. Pliny, want to comment or add anything to the discussion here?
Oh, sorry, I'm just checking if my microphone is good. The creating the right guidelines is definitely important, but as a technology, like as we're discussing the use of technologies, I think it's important for us to also keep the developers involved as well in all of this. We see a number of different countries around the world crying for solutions, requesting contact tracing apps to be developed in like 1 or 2 weeks so that they could be deployed right away with very minimal privacy considerations on them. And we're going to see a number of those still being released out there because, again, there is no central regulation to ensure that this is prevented. I strongly believe that the partnership that we're seeing today between Apple and Google provide like a very good foundation for new contact tracing apps that would be developed based on that framework. But it's still like, I think it's a big challenge to make sure that all the innovators and all the app developers out there are following these protocols. As a country, of course, we can create regulations. We can ensure that the contact tracing apps in our countries are being built with the right protocols in place. But I think the World Health Organization, for example, will play a very central role in ensuring that everything that goes out, all the different apps that are released in the market, that they follow the minimum requirements that we have been discussing.
Douglas? Oh, sorry, Deborah?
If I could quickly add, what's unique with Canada, I think, versus other jurisdictions is the way we are just the division of powers between nationally and the provinces. So obviously we have health is regulated provincially. So there's a lot of provincial players involved, and it's public health, it's the ministries of health, it's all in these, and in some parts, some of the orders are coming at the municipal level. So there's so many levels that are involved, and it's getting a national approach, which I think is very important for what we do, and then making sure we can have a harmonization of any sort of regulatory oversight. So commercial organizations like the Googles and the Apples are involved in the development, and are they subject to PIPEDA? And then you've got the provincial health authorities, and they've got their public sector legislation, and nationally we've got the Privacy Act with the federal government. Then we've got PIPEDA. All of these things are interplaying, which I think is why it's important that the Privacy Commissioner and his Daniel Tarion and his provincial counterparts came out with a joint statement of what the expectations are for government authorities that are involved in this. And if I can add to what Maura said about transparency and consent, it's also important, and it goes back to the proportionality of the reasonable person, which is a basic founding principle in all privacy laws. Is it reasonable? Is what you're saying you're doing with the reasonable person expect that to happen? So, someone signs up for this app, is what is being done with that information, is that reasonable to the person? Is that what they were really thinking when they clicked on that box and agreed to it? Whether they read it in long detail or not, that's another story, but is that what they were expecting to happen with their information?
Deborah, well, your point about the federal provincial tension is really interesting in light of the approach that they've taken in Europe in a number of papers that were put out in April of this year. They're urging a European, they call it a union toolbox, that everybody approach it the same way and that these technologies be interoperable as opposed to each member state having their own approach. And you can see what a disaster that would be if you're in Ontario and you're traveling to Alberta and they use a completely different app and system, that it really does need to be regulated more holistically.
Douglas, did you want to comment?
Well, on the technological aspects, I've mentioned before the difficulty of deploying such an infrastructure so quickly. And so all of these issues about consent and mission creep are about what's originally intended, but there's also what happens that's not originally intended. We're going to see mistakes being made. Already, there are some early apps that have been deployed in other jurisdictions that are sending data to third parties like Google and Foursquare because the developers, accidentally included extra software development kits that were sending this data. And then any of this data that's collected, once it's in a central repository, is going to be a very lucrative target. So that whole discussion we had earlier about hacking corporations in this age of COVID, well, centralized contact tracing data is also going to be a very lucrative target for criminals and nation state actors. So, I'd go back to the principle that the best way to ensure that data collected is not being misused, is just to minimize data collection in the first place. You can only breach data that you've collected, so you can't breach data that hasn't been collected.
Absolutely, and in retention too. Don't retain it for longer than you need to, because you can only breach information that you have, and if you no longer have it, then that's not an issue. And I think, though, Douglas, many of the things that you're saying are very common to app development in general. How many times do you download an app and it's like microphone, camera? Well, why do you need that for that? So that's not reason, but you have to agree to it in order to get the other whatever benefits. And it's just these general concepts, and it's a very simple concept. We all know it as privacy by design, but let's just start your starting principles when you're developing something, whether it's a product or a service for a project that has some sort of personal information. Doesn't necessarily have to be identifiable, some personal information. Just think about privacy as an onboarding. You've got your project manager checklist, speak to legal, speak to this, speak to this, speak to this, and maybe you should say speak to privacy.
Absolutely.
And the last step on that checklist, I think, needs to be what you mentioned earlier, Deborah, this transparent public release of specifications and ideally implementations. I think Alberta's contact tracing app was released before the province's privacy commissioner had even completed her privacy impact assessment, which I think it's a bit dodgy. And I don't think there are any public white papers yet, no public review, no public source code. So we really need to demand that.
It's an interesting point, Douglas, because my understanding with PIAs out of Alberta is they usually take about 9 to 12 months to go through the process. So I could be wrong. I say don't quote me, but I'm on a webinar, but I've heard that in circles and in some articles that it takes a really long time to get that PIA to go through. So
this has been very interesting. So obviously we need large scale adoption if this is supposed to be effective, and that requires us to trust, the organizations, the entities who are controlling and implementing and using the data. And that trust obviously needs to be premised on hopefully trustworthiness, which people can determine by track record, as well as sort of the transparency measures and accountability measures you're talking about. So at the end of the day, is it going to work? Are we going to get to that 40 to 80% level adoption? Are we going to get that level of trust, that level of adoption, so it'll actually help? Any thoughts on, because like Deborah said, we don't have 2 years to really figure this all out. It's going to happen in the next few months or not. Any perspectives on whether, at least in the Western, democracies, we're going to get to those voluntary, under these voluntary programs, the levels of adoption where they'll really have a positive impact?
I thought it was interesting. There was recently some articles in the media about Australia, and that for all the use of these tools, that exactly one person got warned. And I think if that's the outcome, there'll be very little adoption. I think people need to see that there's a significant benefit for the privacy risks they're taking on. So I for one, I want to see some of the empirical evidence first before I sign on the dotted line that this is actually doing something. And I don't know, maybe one of the other panelists knows, do we have any proof or success stories, especially for the voluntary ones? I know some of the enforced ones have been successful, but that's a completely different a completely different can of worms.
The data I could find preparing for this said that the largest deployments so far have been Iceland with about 40% adoption, Singapore with 26% adoption. And the early reports out of Iceland are similar to what you said in Australia, but the app has only been helpful in a very, very small number of cases. So we're not hearing success stories, at least I haven't heard many.
And the challenge lies on the fact that in order for you to gather evidence showcasing that the app actually works, you need people to enroll and use the app. But then people won't enroll and use the app until they are comfortable knowing that there is evidence that they are successful, right? So I think that conundrum is something that we're going to have to deal with. I agree with the comments around, like, are we going to be able to do this on voluntary apps? And I don't know the answer to that question. Like, I think, as Maura mentioned, like, the enforced ones were very successful, but are we going to be able to achieve that level of uptake in Western countries, right?
Does it also depend, a serious question, I don't have an opinion on, but does it also depend on the rate of reopening the economy? So if countries are already going to, so you look at the UK, their contact tracing app has been nothing short of a disaster. I mean, they did one, it didn't work, and then another, but they're already opening the economy and they're already saying, well, we're going to get back to normal. So if they've already done this without a large, what's the incentive to download? And it's a serious question for those that are experts in this, but if public health balance and the reinvigorating the economy balance, it's a tricky thing. And if things are moving ahead without, what does it matter, I guess, is the question.
Plino, do you have a?
No, I just forgot your long head. Sorry.
Okay. It's a great question. Does anyone have a thought? I guess maybe we've had a great discussion about contact tracing. I just want to for the last few minutes touch upon a couple other. Well, one quick question: are there other privacy considerations that we need to consider as a part of return to work programs? Michael, I believe you've thought about this quite a bit. So do you want to say a few remarks?
Sure. Yeah. So this is definitely one of these areas where, we need to protect the health and safety of our workforce without necessarily increasing our liability and jeopardizing the personal privacy of our employees. It's a tricky needle that we got to thread. There's a lot of people working on this that are very, very well intentioned, and as a result, it is actually becoming harder and harder for people to stand up to HR and security. But in privacy, you do have to stand up to HR and security and say, you need to slow down a little bit. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. It has to be done ethically. It comes down to significantly minimizing, like in all things that we've been discussing here, minimizing the amount of data that we're collecting, and basically making protection of the data that you do collect a keystone of your program. Where possible, use less restrictive means. So rather than if you're doing some sort of screening or validation of people come back to work and make sure they're not infected or anything, don't be collecting questionnaires. Use negative affirmation questionnaires with defined criteria. So prior to coming back to the office, rather than getting explicit data points, put the onus on self-reporting and good judgment and say work from home and don't come in if you're sick. And rather than collecting that data, work from home until you don't meet those certain criteria. We kind of have to change our cultural approach to working from home and claiming being sick. If you do need to put in some sort of monitoring or screening, you might consider looking at getting a third party to be engaged in doing this. So remove your own HR department from that equation. Kind of how we do ethics reporting and ethics violations reporting. You use an independent third party to facilitate those activities. When you do make a decision to return to work, make sure that you're looking at this in a way that you're only getting enough information, you're getting the right information to make a meaningful decision about what offices to open. Monitor your local infection rates, use local privacy laws, and use the guidance from your DPAs, and let the data tip the scales on a case-by-case basis rather than it being a binary decision as to open all or open none. And then when you do, move slowly. So if there is any kind of a change, slow it down and reverse course quickly and be prepared for that. Sorry, Deborah.
No, my apologies. I was going to say, to your point, I think it's important, just Douglas mentioned it earlier, privacy impact assessment. Make sure you have a privacy impact assessment. So even if you decide you're going to ignore privacy, at least you've considered it and you've had a thoughtful discussion. You've identified the risks and you've decided as an organization you're going to assume those risks. So then at least if there is some sort of regulatory oversight and scrutiny later down the road, you know that you've given your decisions thoughtful consideration. Might not, listen, I don't win often with battles, but that's a good one to win, that you had a privacy impact assessment.
Absolutely. And I'll make one last point in regards to internal contact tracing, if that goes, and I'll kind of be quiet for a moment. But it is really important that when you do actually have employees back in the office, that you have clearly defined policies and procedures to respond in the event that you do have somebody who's maybe being asymptomatic and actually working in the office now declared that they have been infected. You need to know how, as an organization, how are you going to respond? Who's going to be told? How is this going to be communicated? And again, what do you do with that data? So it is really something you have to look at in a very broad perspective, both from a technical perspective and a policy perspective. I will shut up.
Great. So as we're approaching the final minutes, I want to ask one question. In the midst of this upheaval and the visceral appreciation of the importance of readiness and planning, is there an opportunity to get cyber resilience and privacy protections baked into our systems and policies before that amnesia kicks in? And what would this look like? What can researchers industry do to make this happen? What are some of the other sort of ticking time bombs that we can potentially diffuse now that there's a sort of a greater sensitivity to this sort of thing? Plino, do you want to start with something, more on the pandemic? But then I'd welcome comments about sort of non-pandemic systemic threats.
From a pandemic perspective, like what we're just going through the first wave. The reality is that this is going to permeate our lives for the next months, or we don't know how much longer, right? Until we identify a vaccine for the virus. So in the meantime, right, how do we ensure that whatever is being developed, whatever new technologies are being rolled out, follow these procedures? And I go back to my comments that this is not something only at the country level. We need some global guidelines that are followed by institutions by countries and institutions across the globe to follow. And when it comes to ensuring that these systems are resilient, the pandemics are just one of the upcoming challenges that we're going to be dealing with. If we think about global climate change, for example, we're going to be seeing similar situations where we're all working from home again, not because we can't go outside, like because we're afraid to catch a virus, but because the climate is so unstable. Like we're getting like very, very high temperatures or low temperatures across the globe, and we're going to be forced on a similar situation where we're not so interested in doing contact tracing, but we're still forced with staying at home and with this new work from home model. So this is something that I think we should start to think about and be prepared for.
Anyone else want to jump in with thoughts on that? Or other sort of issues, systemic risks that we've typically ignored until they became a serious problem, like climate change is another example.
I'll take a bite. I'd like to emphasize in not only in this particular issue, but in technology larger. I think we need to really start involving all stakeholders in addressing these trade-offs, because all of these technologies have trade-offs, whether it's privacy, security, something else. And I don't just mean involving multiple disciplines like sociologists and psychologists and lawyers and policy people, in addition to the technologists and the public health people, but I mean these tools have very different impacts on different groups within our population. And for example, a false positive on a tracing app for me may be less of an issue if I can afford to stay home and I have a big enough house to quarantine than somebody else who has to leave their house to work in order to put food on the table, or has a small apartment with an extended family living there. And I really think we do need to talk about that. People will experience and feel differently about these kinds of tools and technologies, depending on whether they're in a minority group, whether they're in a group that's stigmatized, whether they're an illegal alien that's afraid of being deported. And I think we have to keep that and accessibility in mind as well as we move forward in developing these technologies.
Thanks so much, Maura. So we've basically reached the end of the first part of this webinar, but I want to give the five panelists, a very quick moment to make any closing remark, including, if possible, a simple action item, call to action for citizens to enhance our security and privacy in the short and medium term. I'll just go in alphabetical order again. Deborah?
I'm just going to start with organizations. So I think organizations should have by design as a basic principle when they're deciding what they're going to do with the collection, use, and disclosure of personal information. And it's important that organizations bake privacy in from the onset.
Thank you. Maura?
I'll just underscore again, these aren't just technology problems with technology solutions. We need everybody at the table. We need the privacy people, we need the legal people, the policy people, because we're not going to solve this with any one discipline.
Wonderful. Plinio?
I'm going to make a comment about like a public health recommendation. I think we should try our best to follow the guidelines and the resources that are being put out by the public health officers around Canada. They are very informed about the best procedures, and I think we should all follow the instructions and respect the decisions.
Thank you. Michael?
I think I'm going to focus mostly on the pandemic planning and preparation. This has basically underscored the reality that many organizations simply weren't prepared for something like this. It really just kind of highlights the fact that as an organization that's involved in working with your employees, you need to make sure that you're forward thinking and looking for worst case scenarios and making sure that you have the appropriate plans in place to address them.
And Douglas?
I think I'd highlight the importance of transparency and consent and data collection and public specification and public scrutiny of these technologies, and the goal of minimizing data collected.
A great thanks to the panelists for this very insightful and engaging discussion. We're wrapping up the first part of this webinar, and I'll hand it over to Bridget to lead us into the final 30 minutes.
Thanks very much, Michele. So big thank you to the audience as well for joining us. I just want to remind the audience to please stay for the Q&A, which begins momentarily. And a reminder that to submit a question, just click the small Q&A in the bottom right corner of your screen and select all panelists before sending the question. So a very big thank you to you, Professor Mosca, for moderating the discussion today. Professor Michele Mosca is a faculty member in the Department of Combinatorics and Optimization in the Faculty of Mathematics at the University of Waterloo. Michele is also co-founder of the Institute for Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo. I'd also like to express a very big thank you to all of the panelists, Deborah, Michael, Maura, Plinio, and Douglas. Your insights and expertise were extremely valuable, and what I noted is it's a very interdisciplinary approach that has to be taken, and that this is a topic, is a very timely topic, and it's of importance to corporations, but also this whole discussion was very much of interest to individuals as well. So to the audience, if you heard anything that intrigued you, or you have further questions you'd like to ask, I invite you to reach out to me, Bridget Maloney. You can find my email on the GEDI homepage where you registered for this event. And for those of you, again, not familiar with GEDI, it stands for Gateway for Enterprises to Discover Innovation at the University of Waterloo. So just would like to highlight that our next panel in the weekly series is next Thursday, June 11th, and it is Rebooting with Research. So we're kicking off the Rebooting with Research series, and the topic is tackling real world problems. Simply go to uwaterloo.ca/jedi/events for information and registration. And we really look forward to seeing you then. So now over to the audience Q&A. Okay, so I'll just share a slide briefly, just with some instructions on the audience Q&A. So these are just a reminder of how to submit your questions. And we have received some great questions already at registration time and throughout this webinar. So I will proceed with the questions. So we're going to start with some that came in already during the registration process. So the first question is, are we planning to do extensive testing and contact tracing? So we, as the GEDI team, assuming the we to mean University of Waterloo, please note that we are bringing, I am bringing forward this question now, but none of the panelists today are really in a position to comment on this. They are relating their own opinions based on their own research and experience. So I'll move forward to question 2. The next question we are going to direct to Michael. So this also comes from the registration process. Someone submitted a question. So question is, if working from home is the new normal and one chooses to do that from a foreign country, will the user potentially be monitored differently because of this? In other words, the place of work and the location of employee now crosses jurisdictional boundaries.
Okay, good question. I would certainly expect that there's going to have to be some changes, and not the least of which for security reasons. But some things that come immediately to my mind would be issues in regards to export controls. If you've ever dealt with the United States, they have something in place called ITAR and DFARS. These are basically restrictions that are put on place for artifacts that are transmitted across international boundaries or shared with even foreign nationals within the United States, based on the United States munitions list and similar. There's restrictions on that depending on where those people are located. Likewise, export controls obviously sometimes have restrictions on where or what national boundaries that data can be shared. So if all of a sudden you have employees working in different regional locations, that's definitely going to potentially have an impact on your business practices. I also see common requests and requirements in our contracts where we have restrictions on where data can be stored and where it can be accessed by. So if, as we move forward in this brave new world, we start considering where people are working from, we have to go back to those contracts and either renegotiate them or consider whether or not that new behavior is going to be acceptable, and given those restrictions. And I guess the last thing I would say is obviously there's going to be different privacy regimes that we have to consider as well. The laws and access to data and how data can be used is going to vary by region. So if all of a sudden we have employees in one region accessing data in another and saving that data in theirs, the privacy regime now has to be considered as part of that. So again, as an organization, you have to evaluate what is going to be the impact and how is that going to how is that going to impact your organization's objectives?
Thanks, Michael. Would anyone else like to comment?
I was going to add, Michael sort of mostly touched upon it, but really data localization. So under PIPEDA, in Canada's privacy law for commercial organizations, there is no data localization requirement. It's really about disclosure. If you're going to have information that's going to go outside Canada, you have to disclose to your customers that it may be processed in another jurisdiction and subject to the laws of that jurisdiction. And I think most organizations' privacy policies state that already. But then ultimately, to Michael's point, it becomes a contractual. What are your contracts with your customers, your vendors? What did they say about where you can have information stored? So if you have someone that's working outside the jurisdiction and they need to access your systems, are they accessing information that's then going to be outside that jurisdiction? And really, can you segment out? And I think most large organizations can't segment out by specific, this customer A will be here, customer B will be treated this. So it's usually typically that data stays within Canada because people can't make that segmentation.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, another question came in. So Maura, I'll put this one to you. So earlier in the pandemic, the news was reporting that people in certain regions were better than others at social distancing. And this report was based on information collected by tracking cell phones. China is blatant in the use of technology to monitor its people, but in Canada, this seems to be much more covert. Should we be worried about conclusions being derived based on our cell phone metadata? And what agencies are fighting to protect our privacy rights? Maura, there, now you're off mute.
Okay, I'm going to break that up into a couple of questions. I don't necessarily know if it's that some people are better at social distancing than others, as opposed to cultural differences, employment differences, et cetera, make it easier or harder for certain groups to social distance. If you work in a meat processing plant, I'm not sure that you have great options available to you if you must go in. If you're in Italy, for example, the population is more elderly than it is in some other places. So I don't know that we can just say that whole cultures or whole countries are better or worse than others in social distancing, but taking a little bit the premise of the question, is there a possibility for stigmatization? Yes, definitely. I think there is, especially with the second kind of tracing that we talked about. The first kind is the more personal warnings. The second is when that data is aggregated and people are looking for hotspots. If you found out a certain neighborhood with people of a certain race or gender or economic status lived in that area and one of them worked with you, yes, that may impact your behavior. So I think there is a high risk. I'm not sure that there's anybody fighting for our privacy rights as much as putting out guidance, some of which Deborah talked about in the webinar. I would strongly commend people to the 4 papers that were put out by the European Commission, the eHealth Network, two by the European Commission, and also a set of guidelines, all in April of this year. I think it's some of the most sensible and detailed advice I've seen, but I'll turn it to Deborah in terms of if there's anybody fighting for rights as opposed to just putting out guidelines and suggestions.
Thank you, Maura. Before I actually address that directly, I think I want to just peel back a little bit of a layer of the question. The question seems to suggest that somehow there's tracking of cell phones. So, I mean, outside of apps where people have voluntarily downloaded and there's maybe a GPS or a Bluetooth model of sharing information, I mean, I think it would be a misnomer to suggest that anyone in Canada is tracking cell phone usage and movements willy-nilly, because that's just simply not the case. But is there anyone fighting for privacy rights? Well, I mean, obviously our federal privacy commissioner, Daniel Tarian, he is quite an advocate for privacy rights. He did sign on earlier this year. It's a global, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for, but it's basically pushing the concept of privacy as a human right. So he's out there as, I mean, a regulator and an advocate for privacy and human rights. There are some consumer groups that are interested in this area, but to Maura's point, I don't know if it's necessarily large scale fighting for privacy rights. I mean, they're obviously interested, but also, you know, in Canada, this is my pitch for Canada having strong legislation. We do have really strong privacy protections in Canada. Organizations that are subject to the privacy laws really take that seriously, but it's also a matter of doing the right thing as organizations in this country, because most businesses and large organizations trade on their reputation. So, you know, no one wants to be on the front page of the Global Mail for doing something that is treading on the rights of Canadians' privacy rights. So I would add that.
Thank you, Deborah. So actually related to that, Plenio, is it in fact necessary to track individual cell phones to know distancing is happening, or can anonymized data be used in bulk to determine this?
So, as we discussed before, like you can achieve the same objectives through old school contact tracing using like simple phone calls. However, if we're using mobile phone data, yes, we would need we don't need to track individual cell phones to the extent that we're monitoring their exact location, as many of the apps out there are doing, like by tracking GPS data, but we're able to actually track the connections, right? So when you actually got in proximity with another individual that may have had COVID-19. So like you still need that data at the individual level to be able to perform contact tracing. However, there are numerous applications for anonymized bulk data that could be used by public health officials to understand the progression of the disease. So I think there are two pieces here. Like contact tracing, yes, you need to identify when two individuals got in proximity, but the use of the data, yes, it could be used in bulk and anonymized.
Yeah, Plenio, I think what you're describing is not, it's a heat map, right? It's not uncommon from Google Maps. Google Maps knows that there's 50 cars sitting on the 401. So therefore there's perhaps a backup, you know, there's signals there. So there's a backup. So, you know, if you're taking de-identified information, so it's already stripping out the personal identifiers, and then you're aggregating it. So it's two layers of anonymization of the data, and it's typically done at source. So, and then you've got that, so you know that and it's creating heat maps. So you can determine in the COVID scenario, is everyone, how many people are at Parliament Hill on July 1st? And you know, if you see a lot of large red dots, then you know that there's a lot of people there, and they're maybe not, they're not physically distancing that much.
I also think that we need to be careful with the excessive surveillance caused by these technologies, right? Like if you look, for example, if you look at the Toronto Public Health, they recently released a dashboard that you can see the different neighborhoods and the number of COVID-19 cases per neighborhood, right? And going back to the stigma and to overexposing vulnerable individuals, vulnerable communities, right? That's a big issue. And imagine if we were able to bundle that with real-time contact tracing information, right? That's even more critical, because then you would be able to, in real time, identify if that community is following the guidelines. So we're stuck in between a system that is able to deliver the benefits for pandemic control, but on the other hand, we need to be careful with the societal impacts that this technology will have.
That's a great point, Kaleno. And the privacy commissioner's joint statement was two of the principles were around vulnerable populations and making sure that anything you're doing, and also that location data is sensitive when it comes to socioeconomic, and you layer on vulnerable populations. So being mindful of that, and that's I think that's key.
Thanks, Deborah. Thank you, Plinio. So a question for you, Douglas, and then we'll move over to Michael for a question after that. So, Douglas, as it relates to contact tracing apps, it seems it will be almost impossible to settle on one app so that we have a single database to track and analyze within a jurisdiction, like, for example, provinces, and across a country or continent. What are your thoughts on that, Douglas?
So it's a great question. In the Canadian context, our constitutional structure makes health a provincial responsibility. So I think it'd be really hard to see a national app, and so far we are not seeing that emerge. I think there's also the risk of private apps being developed that are not coming from health authorities. Now, one limiting factor on that is Apple, for example, has said that their API will only be available to authorized public health authorities. So I myself, I couldn't push an app to the Apple App Store that uses the contact tracing API. So I think we will see, local jurisdictions push forward apps, and that will be a relatively unique app within that jurisdiction. But I think there's still, the possibility of multiple apps emerging, maybe serving the different goals that we talked about, exposure notification versus epidemiological data collection. I think that's important. We want to be careful there to make sure that people don't have to give up the right to get exposure notification by also having to give up epidemiological data.
Thanks, Douglas. And then actually following on from that, Michael, excuse me, are you, or maybe another panelist, aware of a reliable source that has analyzed all the many contact tracing apps available?
No, I wish I was. I don't have anything that would satisfy that at this point.
I seem to recall something in the back of my mind, and I wish I had known this question was coming, but obviously it happened on the fly. I do seem to recall something that there is an organization, a global organization, that was looking at the various different, and it was based on jurisdiction. It's on the tip of my tongue, but I cannot name it, but apologies. But sorry, go ahead, Douglas.
I do have an answer to that question, or at least a partial answer. I saw it come in, so I did some searching. The best one I could find is strangely something by a website called Top 10 VPN, which is, I think, a VPN review site, but they also seem to have an analysis of about 50 different contact tracing apps. I don't know how reliable it is, but at least it is fairly exhaustive.
I'd be kind of curious, especially given how fast everything's evolving in this world. I mean, this area, there's something coming out new every day, so that's going to be something that's going to be difficult to keep track of, at least initially.
And this is, as Douglas was mentioning as the first question, I was going to say, it's interesting that, I know we've got, like you said, the constitutional, but federally, I think towards the middle of last week, they said, well, we're going to come out with some sort of national app, but it's, bit, I don't know, has already left the barn. Alberta's come out with theirs. Newfoundland said that they're going to come out with something. There's various different provincial governments that have already signaled that they're so much further down the road. And now, if the national app comes after the fact, and how does that, what's the interplay between all of this? And it gets so complicated. And as a consumer and an end user of these potential, I'm confused, and I work in the field of privacy, and I'm confused. So what's the average consumer that, I think, how would my 78-year-old mother, she'd struggle. She would have no idea.
And that maybe goes to the transparency point we've all been talking about throughout, is maybe when you release one of these, you should have to disclose the trade-offs you've made in your tool, whether it's a centralized database or decentralized, all the stuff that I talked about during the panel. Where's the data being stored? How's it being stored? Who has access? And maybe we should require that so that people can make informed choices between the various apps.
Thank you.
It's COVID-19, something that came out of the Montreal Institute. That's been.
I believe that's more to do with communication and less with regards to exposure notification or tracing.
Right.
It's called COVID Canada, like it's led by Mila. There is an interesting article by the MIT Technology Review called "A Flood of Coronavirus Apps Are Tracking Us. Now it's time to keep track of them." It was released on May 7th, so it's slightly outdated, but they provide an overview probably of like 20, 30 of those apps. So it's a good starting point. Well, there are 25 on the website.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So just a couple of questions still coming in. So I'll direct this one to Plinio, and then following that, Michele, I'll direct one to you. So Plinio, in the news, we've been hearing about companies or other organizations using software for monitoring. So again, on the monitoring theme here, do you foresee this becoming the norm, and how does this change the considerations around privacy? We've tracked working hours for decades. So is the concern about contact tracing really about the erosion of personal space and time?
So I think there's a big difference between tracking your hours that you have been working and tracking the fact that you have a very contagious disease. Like when we're tracking our hours, like it's all voluntary. You're the one going into the system and entering your hours, logging them in, and deciding how to do that. When it comes to contact tracing, especially on the systems that are automated, right? We lose that control. Like ideally, systems that can deliver the benefit to the community, they would have many of the systems already implemented and automatized so that we don't have to manually go there and notify people. However, that voids that control that you have over your data in the case of reporting your hours as mentioned. So I think that's the biggest difference that we need to understand here, is that when it comes to contact tracing, we lose that control unless you're forced. You're going to have to consent to use that platform, but still, like it's not something that has a gate that you can say, oh yes, I want to share my data with these 10 people. Once you've consented to use one of these apps, your data is out there. There's no more control over the data.
If I can add on top of that with Plinio, there was the privacy commissioner back, and I'm trying to think of the name. I'm sorry, I'm like lost for words today. The train derailment in Quebec from several years ago. And really there was an issue about the video and the voice recordings and tracking, and the privacy commissioner had a lot to say in that area. And there's similar things here around tracking that can be learned from that involvement of the privacy commissioner. But I think on these closed loop ones that are in employers, it's also about, well, is it a unionized environment? And what's the bargaining agreement, and what's the local employment law? So I think that when you get, those are bigger concerns and bigger hurdles to move over, other than the privacy component. So when you're looking at the closed loop ones, I think those are the biggest concerns.
I think we also have to be aware that individuals are going to be making their own personal health decisions, not just based on infection, but about risk factors. And those risk factors may be medical conditions that they don't feel that they want to share. So they may want to avoid exposing themselves to a risky situation without saying that I have, a congenital health issue that you don't need to know about.
or even not even necessarily their own. It could be people in their family that they don't want to be disclosing.
Thank you. Thanks. So I'll move to Michele. And for everyone, please, as you are, please feel free to add in your comments. So how do pandemic events like this, where the general population is pushed to adopt new and emerging technologies, impact people's valuation of their privacy?
So that's an interesting question. I think it's important to be proactive. So I think what happens in a crisis situation, a lot of values get thrown under the bus, and our privacy and freedom is at risk, I think, because you're kind of faced with this survival or, and we don't want to, but as Plinio alluded to earlier, that's completely preventable if we're proactive. We could have the tools and processes and playbooks ready so we can stay safe and protect our privacy and freedoms. And of course, if you're not proactive, then you do have a bit more of a dilemma on your hands in real time. And I really hope we're this lesson well this time, and we prepare more proactive design, privacy and freedoms as well as security into our platforms and processes and so on, so that for the next unexpected disruptive event, we're ready to go with tools and practices that allow us to protect our privacy and freedoms while achieving, security or whatever other objective we need to achieve in real time.
Right.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with that. In my classes, I always ask my students whether they'd prefer convenience or privacy, and it really shouldn't be an either or. You should be able to get off the bus and know where all your friends are hanging out, but somehow there should be some privacy there too. And I think it goes back to what Deborah had referred to before as privacy by design. I think you can't shove privacy on after the fact. It has to be from day one, built into the product. But we shouldn't have to decide, do I want this article and do I have to give up cookies and all kinds of other stuff?
Maura, you make me reminiscent of the days where your trade-off was, am I going to get this? I'm getting this for free. So Gmail's for free or Facebook's for free. So it's okay. I'm going to give them all my personal information. And boy, have times have changed, haven't they? You no longer have to make that trade-off because they've, some organizations have disappointed society and people are now saying, actually, no, I'm not going to make that trade-off.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of the session. Unfortunately, I want to apologize. The audience questions continue to come in. So obviously it's a very interesting topic for a lot of people. And there were a few questions we just didn't have time to get to. So I want to thank you again to the audience for your participation, and a special, really big thank you to Michele as moderator, and to Deborah, Michael, Maura, Plinio, and Douglas for answering all the questions and providing your expertise and your insight. It's really been informative and enlightening discussion on really topical matters that a lot of people, both individual citizens, corporations, are very interested in. So thank you very, very much. For the audience, if you have further questions we were not able to get to, or maybe you heard something today that intrigued you to explore further, again, I invite you to reach out to me, Bridget Maloney, Managing Director of GEDI at the University of Waterloo. You can find my email on the GEDI homepage where you registered for the event. So I'd like to share the upcoming series of webinars. So you should see that our next panel is Thursday, June 11th, and this is all around, these three in the series are around rebooting with research. And on the 11th is tackling real world problems. Please go to uwaterloo.ca/jedi/events for information and registration. And thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you then. And this closes our session for today. I want to thank everyone again, moderator, panelists, and the audience for joining us. It's been really, really interesting discussion. So thank you and goodbye.